And I left MAGA. I didn't set out to become MAGA. I just loved Jesus. But in church, I was taught that America was a nation under attack by Satan, and that abortion and gay marriage were cursing the nation.
I'm James, and I left MAGA in mid-2020. I supported Trump out of a failure of imagination. When my parents and grandparents would talk about racism, I thought that was their time. Times have changed. So I gave MAGA the benefit of the doubt.
My name's Justin Yu, and I left MAGA. When Donald Trump ran the first time, I liked the idea of having a president that was not a career politician.
You just heard from people who walked away from MAGA. Now meet the guy collecting their stories. Rich Logis spent nearly 7 years inside the movement, not as a bystander.
I was a MAGA pundit. I had my own podcast. I was in a state of panic, terrified that Democrats were destroying our country.
Now, he's the founder of Leaving MAGA, a digital confession booth for ex-believers. Rich, kind of take me to the beginning. Were you conservative to start off with, or did you jump right into MAGA? How did this all work?
Well, let me just say thank you so much for having me here. I'm hoping I can bring some value and some insights to those who are watching and listening. I actually thought that both parties were the same. In fact, before MAGA, and I would even say that on some issues, I was probably even left-leaning on some of them. But I gravitated to MAGA for a lot of the same reasons most who are in MAGA right now did, which was the camaraderie and the sense of belonging and the community that being in MAGA provided. There are many who might call MAGA a cult. That's not a descriptor I think, excuse me, is accurate to describe MAGA. It is a place where people have shared concerns and fears and hopes and dreams like many other Americans do. But I was not somebody who, I was someone, I should say, who was very political, but I was very pessimistic and very cynical. And if we remember back to 2016, before Trump ran for office, the election was going to be Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton. And so I was very much attracted to Trump as a true outsider without any government, without any military experience. He seemed like the right person for the job. I felt like the entire political system needed to be torn down and built anew. And he spoke to that. And he raised some valid economic concerns. There's a lot of trauma in the country then and now, economically, of people who have lost jobs, seen their work go overseas, once vibrant communities that got hollowed out, and he gave voice to that, and that really resonated with me.
Well, what about the other stuff? Because I remember when he came down that escalator and said something about migrants being rapists and then mocking someone with disability, the reporter. I remember that. That was 2016. What did that say to you? Was that a turnoff or was it not? It wasn't a deal breaker.
I didn't defend it, but I had come to believe somewhat quickly that the alternative, meaning Hillary and the Democrats, were worse. And I was more curious about Trump in the beginning. I wasn't somebody who said, to this day, I did not then, and I don't say now that I was supporting him the moment he came down the escalator. It took me some time to develop my support for him. But as I was developing that support, I came to believe that if Hillary and the Democrats won the 2016 election, that they would never lose power again.
Well, let me ask you a question, because I think we've both been around for a while. I remember Trump from the 80s. I remember all that mess. Did you know about his history? Did you not know anything about him before, except for the maybe Apprentice? I mean, like, what did you know about him?
I actually once interviewed Donald Trump when I was a former reporter many years ago.
Okay.
I was a journalist, and I was writing a story. It was a business-focused story, and it was not a political story. And it was about a golf course that he wanted to build in Westchester County, which is where I'm from and where I lived for many, many years. And I never saw Trump as somebody who was harmful. I knew about his business background. I never watched The Apprentice. Mm-hmm. I wasn't someone who paid close attention to him or a lot of his history. So even though I didn't even though I did not agree with the statements he made about the late John McCain or Mexicans or women or Muslims, as I developed more and more my interest for Trump, I concluded that in order to prevent the Democrats from seizing indefinite power, Trump needed to be the one who got elected. And at the end of 2015, early 16, I decided to work on his campaign. I was a grassroots activist. I wrote part of the call script. I did phone banking, a lot of the work that volunteers do. There are many volunteers who did more work than I did, but no one was as devoted to the volunteer work as I was when I was looking to help get him elected.
So what did you think the Democrats were going to do? How were they so much worse?
You know, looking back, I have a hindsight answer on this, because when I look back on it now, I know that that way of thinking was largely driven from a lot of Republican and also to some extent some Democratic thinking. I remember hearing for many, many years under President Obama, demographics are destiny. And I think that to some extent, both parties actually believe that after the election of President Obama. So that way of thinking informed my electoral decisions, because if demographics were destiny, then it meant that the Democratic Party would not lose power had Hillary won. And I also believed at the time, even though I know looking back on it, I was wrong to think this, I was a business owner. I was relatively successful at that period of time. I thought Hillary and the Democrats winning would harm my business. So I had some survivalist instincts that kicked in as well. But looking back on it, I look at it, Angela, and I know that it was more delusional than reality the way that I thought about this. But I wasn't just a Trump supporter who was just a partisan voter. I was a true believer. I fully believed in the movement, and I was wholly behind his candidacy.
When you talk about, and I'm going to get to that in a second, but even with the business stuff, now Trump had all those bankruptcies. Did that not factor in?
I actually don't even recall at the time if I even knew about them. And if I did, I will tell you that it wouldn't have mattered to me.
I could ask you, because you just said you were a true believer.
Yes.
What does that mean?
True believer is somewhat complicated in that it doesn't mean that you always agree with the president, but when you disagree, you don't say it publicly. Because any public admonitions of the president would make you akin to a Democrat or an anti-Trump Republican or conservative. And I know what people are going to, when they're hearing that out there, I know what they're going to think. They're going to say, it sounds like a cult. It sounds like a cult. Mm-hmm. I agree that there are some cult-like aspects to being a true believer. And I understand why people who have never been in MAGA, Angela, might say it was a cult. But what makes it, the reason I believe it's not a cult, more of a community, is that even though it is hard to leave, and I'll get into some of the reasons why I left, yes, it's difficult to leave, but people can walk away from MAGA. So a true believer is someone whose entire political identity is entangled in the MAGA movement. For me, it was my being, it was my personhood, it was all consuming. I had a second family, and even as much as I'm embarrassed to say this, that second family oftentimes took precedence over my own blood family. And I neglected some of my familial duties as a parent and as a husband because of the MAGA movement. True believer transcends partisanship. And after the 2016 election, we were validated. Mm-hmm. And our efforts were vindicated. So I didn't say to others, see, in 4 years, I got deeper and deeper into the movement. I became a podcaster. I had bylines in places like Fox, The Federalist, WorldNet Daily, which is the site that originated the Obama birther conspiracy. Mm-hmm. I was all in. I was a true believer. I was completely subsumed into the MAGA culture. What
is the identity? Because you mentioned that word. What is the identity?
The identity is really based, it's really comes back to the need that we have for communal existence. And in that identity, Angela, there is this belief that we were on the right side of history, and that we were the real Americans, and that anybody who wasn't with us, whether they were Democrats or liberals or progressives or anti-Trump Republicans and conservatives, they were the fake Americans, the fake patriots, and they were on the opposite side of us. Anybody who was not with us, we determined was an existential threat to the safety and betterment of our country. Now, I know how extreme that sounds, but that's the belief that I had, and it's the belief that's pervasive across MAGA right now, which is a belief that anyone not with us posed an existential threat to our lives, our livelihoods, our families, and our country. And that's what that identity is really shaped upon.
And it's still strong, obviously.
Absolutely. And even though I think there have been cracks that have been starting to show, the allegiance remains strong. And it's strong because of how invested people are into this community. And I don't just mean financial, I mean personally, politically as well.
And that's what I want to talk about, because you mentioned it was like your second family. How were you invested? Like, what were you doing?
There was
Go ahead.
There was never a day that went by that I wasn't doing something related to the cause, whether it was writing, whether it was podcasting, whether it was speaking at Trump events, sponsoring Trump events, being in touch with fellow Trumpist MAGA patriots. There was not a day for years that went by, Angela, that I did not communicate with my fellow MAGA compatriots. So it wasn't that we took a day off. There was no time to take a day off because we were in this good versus evil battle against all enemies in any of those who were not with us. So when you're doing that every single day, that also partly defines what a true believer is, because for me, it was something that I never took an hour off from MAGA. It was my life. It was how I politically, it was my worldview. It was anything that didn't have to do with my personal life. It was political. And even in my personal life, MAGA found its way to seep into it.
How so?
Well, really, because I sacrificed part of my business. I devoted time to MAGA when I could have been devoting it to my business as well as to my familial duties. But because I was always in this adrenaline-fueled fight or flight mode, that's what made MAGA all-consuming for me.
How does that happen? Because it's you said flight or fight or flight.
Yeah.
It's like all this. You're pumped up all the time.
Pumped up.
How the hell do you exist that pumped up? Seriously.
I think we convince ourselves, and I certainly convinced myself, that we had a belief that if we didn't strike first, then the opponent and the enemy would strike us. And that's how militaristic the mindset really was. That's what I thought. The ones I was around whom I allowed to influence me, that's how they thought. And I stress, Angela, the allowed, because even though all of us are susceptible to being influenced, all of us also have agency. And all of my decisions, all of my rhetoric, all of my choices, I take full responsibility. No one forced me into thinking or doing anything that I did.
What did this community look like?
It was actually a little more diverse than maybe a lot of other people might think about that, or may realize. And I was around people who were legal and financial professionals. I was around public sector workers. I was around and congregated with Ivy League graduates. And we weren't all just white male Americans. There were some Hispanics, there were some Black Americans who were part of our community. And my community in particular was really here in South Florida. I had some others who were around the country whom I was very close with, but we had a group here, for example, who met every single month. And I would speak at those events.
Wait a
We would
second,
have
you
our
were meeting like in person every month?
in person every single month, and that's in addition to all of the other modes of communication that we did on a daily basis.
You know, a lot of people don't know this was, like I said, I never knew this was happening. I just assumed maybe on Facebook, but there was really a community here that was interacting with you.
Yes, and I would speak. I would get recognized. My work and my podcast and my writings were people followed me. We would discuss my work. I was appreciated. I found all of the benefits of a communal existence in MAGA. So there wasn't just online communication. We were actually meeting in person to break bread and discuss our why MAGA was the movement that was going to save America.
Now, a lot of people consider MAGA an alpha male movement. Where were the women in all this?
You know, there were women who were with us, and you know they were wives. They were also true believers, and that was a diverse makeup as well. It wasn't just white women, for example, who were in our group. There were also other Black Americans. There were Hispanics. We even had some LGBTQ members of our South Florida community we would meet with. So it goes to show that there was and is a somewhat of a wide appeal for those who get entangled up in MAGA, and it becomes the place where it's comfortable for them.
Was there an underlining thread when you say that your crowd was diverse, whether it was women or Latinos or LGBTQ or Black and then white people? Was there an underlining thread that you saw besides Trump and MAGA that connected you? Was it fear? Was it wanting patriotism? Was there something there that kind of that weaved everything together?
Yes, I would say many emotions. You know, something that when I look back on my time in MAGA, MAGA kept me in these perpetual states of desperation and panic and despair, and to use a fancy philosophical term, this all or none nihilism. And that comes back to the adrenaline, being psyched up, fight or flight part of being a MAGA true believer. So there's no question that fear, that desperation, that panic, the anxieties that we had about those who were not MAGA, they were definitely ties that bound us.
So you were juiced up on fear.
Absolutely, amongst some other emotions, but fear was omnipresent within the community.
Fear of what? I mean, when you think about, I kind of got it, like the America is changing, that the Democrats, they would never leave office. How would that make America look? How would that change America?
You know, there were lots of irrational fears, and you can have there's a pick of the litter of fears. You know, everything ranging from Democrats were coming for our guns to the public schools were indoctrinating our kids into transgender Marxism. Democrats were looking to import brown people so that way they would vote Democrat over the course of many, many years, and Democrats would come. We're back to Democrats seizing power. Fear about a declining white majority, that was also present within. And when you hear these coming out of MAGA, having one of the reasons that I left is because I diversified my news and information sources. And I came to understand that so many of these beliefs that I held were just, when scrutinized, were not accurate. So, you know, there's no teacher I've ever met who has the time to indoctrinate children into communism and Marxism. But when you're in MAGA, we believe that the public schools are yet another one of our enemies whom we need to do political battle against.
You know, it's funny you say that, because I have a friend who's a teacher and she can't even get her kids to do their homework. But yet you think some teacher is convincing some kid that they want a boy wants to be a girl and they're going to go
right.
their penis. I've never understood that, but there are a lot of people thinking that. So what you're saying is that people didn't question whether that was true or not. They believed it.
There is not an emphasis on cultivating learning within MAGA. Now, that doesn't mean that the people in MAGA lack intelligence. It's just that any information that would refute the pervasively held mythologies of MAGA, like the ones I mentioned about guns and importing brown people. Any information that would rebuff what we believed was kept out. So we only consumed right-wing media sources. In addition to the sites I wrote for, I only consumed right-wing media. You know, for example, Breitbart. I lived on that site. I lived in the content. I lived in the comments section. It was the site that I consumed more than any other, was Breitbart. So there wasn't an emphasis on diversifying our news and information sources within MAGA. That didn't exist then. It doesn't exist right now. It's why mis and disinformation is rife across all MAGA communities, irrespective of where they are.
Part 2, Rich discusses why he finally left MAGA on Angela Gets Answers.